Welcome back. Today on our journey through the Bible, we will learn about Israel's season of
Jesus
peace.
loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me, yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so.
Time of peace. Our memory verse today comes from Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Wisdom. When King David was an old man and very sick, nearing his end, another of his sons, Adonijah, decided that he should be king. With support from Joab and other allies within the kingdom, Adonijah had himself crowned king. The prophet Nathan informed Bathsheba of this, and immediately she went to the king and told him what his son was doing. So David called the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and his son Solomon. While David was still alive, Solomon was officially crowned king over Israel. Solomon was paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, riding on the king's mule. Solomon was still a young man when he became king over Israel. Therefore, David gave his son strict instructions on the things he must do as king. Being taught by the prophet, Solomon was a thoughtful and conscientious young man. One night, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and asked him what he would like the Lord to give him. Being a God-fearing man and aware of his limitations, Solomon asked God for wisdom, wisdom to govern the people aright. He realized the immense responsibility that was on him as a young man with very little experience. This request pleased God, so he granted Solomon wisdom above all other men. And in addition to wisdom, God granted him wealth beyond all other kings and kept Israel's enemies subdued during his reign. A test of his wisdom arose when two women came to the king disputing over a baby. One woman's child had died in the night, and she exchanged her dead child with the second woman's living child. Next morning, the second woman noticed the swap and raised the complaint. The king considered the situation and offered a solution to divide the baby in half, giving half to each woman. The first woman agreed to the king's proposal, and the second begged the king not to kill the child and to let the first woman have the baby. From these responses, the king knew that the second woman was the true mother of the baby. News of Solomon's wisdom spread far and wide. Rulers and monarchs from across the world came bearing gifts to behold his wisdom and learn of its source. The Queen of Sheba came to test Solomon and was left breathless following her encounter with this wise king. The Temple. When David was done fighting wars and some level of peace was present in the land of Israel, he thought of God's dwelling place in Jerusalem. The Ark of God and the sanctuary services were still occurring in the old fabric tabernacle Moses made in the wilderness. David saw that it was not right that he, as the earthly king, could live in a well-made palace and God's presence was still dwelling in a now tattered 480-year-old tent. So David called the prophet Nathan and presented his idea. Nathan thought it an inspired idea and immediately responded that he should go ahead and do what was in his heart. However, that night, God told Nathan to return and tell the king that he could not build the temple because David had been a man of war and had killed too many people. His son Solomon, however, would be the one to build the temple for God. David accepted God's judgment. He instructed Solomon and made all the arrangements and sourced all the material for the temple to be built. Now that Solomon was king and he was settled into his position, it was time to construct the temple. Solomon contacted all the building suppliers with whom his father had made arrangements and assembled all the artificers, and construction began. In accordance with all of God's specifications, the temple was completed, and it was known throughout the world as a wonder to behold. Following the construction and blessing and placement of all the articles of furniture and tools in the temple, Solomon held a dedication ceremony. The priests offered sacrifices and offerings to God, and Solomon prayed a prayer of thanksgiving. God was so pleased with the offerings the Israelites gave him, he sent fire from heaven to consume the sacrifices and offerings on the altar, just as he did for Abel. His presence filled the entire temple that the priests could not enter into it. Peace lost. After building the temple and a palace for himself, God appeared to Solomon a second time with a warning. God informed Solomon that if he would continue to serve him, that he would establish his family as rulers of all Israel forever. However, if he or his children were to disobey God and serve false gods, he would cut Israel off and make them an example for all nations to see what comes of disobedience. However, as it is in human nature, Solomon lost his vigilance and became restless. He had a lot of wisdom, a lot of wealth, and a lot of power, and he was a very curious man. In his own words, "Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor." If you can imagine it, Solomon did it. He married 700 wives and kept 300 concubines. He married women that did not believe in Jehovah, and they led him astray to worship many different false gods. He built temples and altars to all these false gods to make his wives happy. He made deals with heathen nations to expand his wealth and fortify Israel's military, in opposition to God's direct commands. Because of Solomon's sins, God said he would take the kingdom from his family. However, for David's sake, the entire kingdom would not be taken away. Solomon repented of his sins. Therefore God said the split would not occur in Solomon's time, but in his son's time. From all his experiences, Solomon left many proverbs and warnings for future generations that would take heed. King Solomon's summary of all he had experienced in his own words was this: "Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun." He concluded his experience with these timeless words of wisdom. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Now it's time for our activity. First question: why was King David not allowed to build the temple? Correct. David had been a man of war and had killed many, many people. Next question: what good thing did Solomon ask God for, and what all did God bless him with? Yes, Solomon asked God for wisdom. We should all ask God for wisdom. And God blessed him with wisdom, wealth, and a reign of peace. Last question. How did God show his pleasure at the construction of the temple? That's right. Just like he did for Abel, he sent fire to consume the sacrifices, and he filled the temple with his presence. Now try to write or say the memory verse from memory.
Yes, Jesus loves
Next time,
me.
we'll read about
Yes,
how the
Jesus
kingdom
loves
was
me.
divided.
Yes, Jesus loves me, for the Bible tells me so.